We constantly hear about the United States owing trillions, China's massive debt, Japan's staggering debt to GDP ratio, and European nations grappling with their own financial burdens. This seemingly endless cycle begs for clarification, as it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how national debt truly operates. This isn't just a philosophical puzzle, it has profound implications for our economies, our governments, and our future. Today, we'll unravel this mystery, examining the biggest economies, breaking down their debt, and most importantly, revealing the surprising entities and individuals who are actually holding the bag. The answer isn't a simple case of one country owing another. It's far more intricate, interconnected, and frankly, a lot more fascinating than you might imagine. Let's get started. Before we can answer the "who owes whom" question, we need a solid understanding of what national debt actually is. It's not like your personal credit card bill or a mortgage. When we discuss a country's national debt, we refer to the total amount of money the government has borrowed over time and has not yet repaid. This accumulated borrowing primarily occurs when a government spends more than it collects in taxes and other revenues in a given year, resulting in a budget deficit. To cover this shortfall, the government issues financial instruments, predominantly government bonds or securities, which are essentially IOUs. These bonds represent promises to repay the principal amount, plus interest, by a specified date. They are purchased by a wide range of entities because they are generally considered very safe investments, particularly for stable, developed economies. The more deficits a country runs, the more bonds it issues, and consequently, the larger its national debt grows. For example, when the US national debt is reported at approximately $36 trillion as of December 2024, that figure represents the cumulative sum of all past deficits, plus interest, that the government currently owes to its creditors. It's a running total, not a one-time bill. It's crucial to distinguish between debt and deficit. A deficit is the annual shortfall between government spending and revenue, while debt is the accumulation of all those past deficits. A country can experience a deficit in one year yet maintain a relatively low overall debt if it has historically managed its finances prudently. Conversely, a country might run a small deficit, but its debt could still be enormous due to decades of prior borrowing. Let's put some numbers to this. Global public debt is projected to exceed a staggering $100 trillion by the end of 2024. While developing countries hold less than a third of this total, their debt has been growing twice as fast as developed economies since 2010, raising significant concerns about their financial stability. Consider the United States, the largest economy and, by total amount, the largest debtor. As of December 2024, the total gross US national debt stood at approximately $36 trillion. This debt generally falls into two main categories: debt held by the public, and intra-governmental debt. About 80% of this, roughly $29 trillion, is debt held by the public, representing cash borrowed from external investors, both domestic and foreign. The remaining 20%, or about $7 trillion, is intra-governmental debt, which is essentially money one part of the government owes to another, primarily federal trust funds like Social Security and Medicare. Next, let's examine Japan, a country often cited for its extraordinarily high debt to GDP ratio. As of March 2025, Japan's general government gross debt was around 1,324 trillion yen, which translates to approximately $8.7 trillion, and a debt to GDP ratio of nearly 235%. This is one of the highest among developed nations. Now, China. While often discussed as a major holder of other countries' debt, China itself has significant and growing debt. According to the IMF, China's general government debt was around 77% of GDP in 2022. However, when including off-balance sheet debt from local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, and state-owned enterprises, the augmented debt figure rises significantly, reaching 124% of GDP in 2024. The overall non-financial debt, which encompasses corporate and household debt, is even higher, at 312% of GDP in 2024. Moving to Europe, Germany is often seen as an economic powerhouse. Its general government debt increased to €2.69 trillion in 2024, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 62.5%. While substantial, this is relatively moderate compared to some other major economies. Finally, the United Kingdom. As of May 2025, the UK's public sector net debt stood at £2,867 billion, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 96.4%. The national debt is reportedly increasing by over £500 million per day. So, we have trillions here, quadrillions there, and percentages that seem to defy gravity. The question remains, if all these powerful nations are deep in the red, who are they writing these massive checks to? This is where the real complexity, and the real answer, lies. This is the core of our discussion. The answer isn't a single entity or even a handful of countries. It's a vast, interconnected web of creditors, both within and outside the borrowing nation. A significant portion of a country's debt is often owed to its own citizens and domestic institutions. When a government issues bonds, who buys them? If you have a savings account, a mutual fund, a pension plan, or life insurance, there's a very high chance that a portion of your money is invested in government bonds. Financial institutions such as banks, pension funds, and insurance companies are massive purchasers of government debt because it's considered a safe, stable investment. So, in a very real sense, a part of the national debt is owed to you. Commercial banks also hold government bonds as part of their assets, for liquidity, and to meet regulatory requirements. As mentioned with the US, intragovernmental debt is a significant component, representing money owed to federal trust funds like Social Security. While technically debt, it's money one part of the government owes another, having no net effect on the government's overall finances. A huge and often misunderstood creditor is the central bank. Central banks, like the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, or the Bank of England, are frequently major holders of their own government's debt. This occurs primarily through a process known as quantitative easing, or QE. During times of economic crisis or slow growth, central banks implement QE by purchasing large quantities of government bonds from commercial banks and other financial institutions. The objective is to inject money into the financial system, lower interest rates, and stimulate economic activity. When a central bank buys government debt, it essentially creates new money to do so. For example, the Federal Reserve is the largest single holder of US public debt, holding about $4.5 trillion. In Japan, the Bank of Japan holds an even more dominant position, owning a staggering 46.3% of the country's government debt as of December 2024. Similarly, approximately a third of the UK's national debt is owned by the British government itself due to the Bank of England's quantitative easing programme. This means that a significant portion of the interest payments on this debt effectively cycles back to the government. When a country owes money to its own central bank, it's a unique situation, not comparable to owing money to an external lender, as the central bank's profits, including interest earned on government bonds, often flow back to the Treasury, creating a circular flow of money within the government's broader financial system. Now, let's discuss foreign creditors. This is where the idea of one country owing another comes into play, but it's still more nuanced than a simple bilateral loan. Many countries hold the debt of other nations as part of their foreign exchange reserves. For instance, Japan and China have historically been the largest foreign holders of US debt. As of March 2025, Japan held about $1.13 trillion in US treasuries, while China held $765.4 billion. The UK has also significantly increased its holdings, becoming the second largest foreign holder of US debt at $779.3 billion as of March 2025. These holdings are often seen as safe investments for their reserves. Just like domestic investors, foreign individuals, banks, pension funds, and investment firms also purchase government bonds from other countries for diversification, safety, and yield. For example, many international investors utilize UK-based financial institutions to manage their capital, and when these institutions purchase US treasuries, the holdings are recorded under the UK, even if the funds originate elsewhere. So, to answer the central question, a country's debt is primarily owed to a mix of its own citizens, domestic financial institutions, its own central bank, and various foreign governments and private investors. It's a complex ecosystem, not a simple debtor-creditor relationship between two nations. Given the massive figures we've discussed, you might wonder why governments borrow so much. Is it simply irresponsible spending? Not necessarily. There are several legitimate and often essential reasons why countries incur debt.
Governments need money to fund public services and infrastructure, building roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals, and providing essential services like healthcare, education, and defense. Tax revenues alone might not always suffice to cover these extensive costs, especially for large-scale, long-term projects. Borrowing allows governments to make these investments now, with the expectation that future economic growth will help repay the debt. Governments also borrow for economic stimulus. During recessions or economic downturns, Governments often increase spending or cut taxes to boost demand and create jobs, a practice known as fiscal stimulus. Such measures frequently lead to larger budget deficits and increased borrowing, but they are deemed necessary to prevent deeper and longer-lasting economic crises. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, saw massive increases in government borrowing worldwide to support economies and healthcare systems. Furthermore, governments borrow in response to crises. Natural disasters, wars, or global pandemics necessitate immediate and substantial financial outlays. Governments borrow to fund emergency relief, reconstruction efforts, or military operations, which are often unforeseen expenses that cannot be covered by existing revenues. Lastly, debt can be productive if it's used for investment for future growth. Investing in education, research and development, or critical infrastructure can lead to higher productivity and increased tax revenues down the line, making the debt easier to manage. So, while debt can certainly signal fiscal challenges, it's also a tool governments use to manage their economies, respond to emergencies, and invest in their future. The key lies in whether the debt is sustainable and used productively. The sheer size of national debts can be alarming, but is all debt inherently bad? Not necessarily. The crucial factor isn't just the absolute amount of debt, but rather a country's ability to service that debt, meaning its capacity to make interest payments and repay the principal when due. Economists often look at the debt to GDP ratio as a key indicator of a country's debt sustainability. Gross domestic product, GDP, represents the total value of goods and services produced in a country, essentially its economic output. Thus, the debt to GDP ratio compares a country's debt to its income, providing a clearer picture of its capacity to repay. For instance, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of nearly 235%, which is incredibly high. Yet, Japan has largely managed this debt without major crises. This is because, as we discussed, most of its debt is held domestically, with a huge portion owned by the Bank of Japan. This domestic ownership makes Japan less vulnerable to external market fluctuations and foreign creditors. The interest payments largely circulate within the Japanese economy, and the Bank of Japan's profits are returned to the government. In contrast, the US debt to GDP ratio was around 123% at the end of fiscal year 2024. Germany's is much lower, at 62.5% in 2024, while the UK's is around 96.4% as of May 2025. The sustainability of debt also depends on factors such as interest rates, where lower rates make debt servicing cheaper. Economic growth is vital, as a growing economy generates more tax revenue, making it easier to manage debt. Currency denomination also plays a role. Countries that borrow in their own currency have more control over their debt, as they can, in theory, print more money to pay it off, though this carries inflation risks. Finally, creditor confidence is paramount. As long as investors have confidence in a country's ability and willingness to repay its debts, they will continue to lend to it at reasonable rates. So, while a high debt figure can be a concern, it's not always a death sentence. The context, the economic fundamentals, and who holds the debt are equally, if not more, important. What this all reveals is a deeply interconnected global financial system. When one country borrows, it's not just a transaction between two isolated entities. It's part of a vast network where capital flows freely across borders. The fact that countries hold each other's debt creates a powerful incentive for stability. For example, China holding a significant amount of US debt means that China has a vested interest in the stability and health of the US economy, as a collapse would devalue its own investments. This interdependence can act as a stabilizing force, discouraging aggressive financial moves that could harm multiple parties. However, it also means that financial shocks in one part of the world can ripple outwards. A major economic crisis in a large debtor nation could impact the balance sheets of its creditors, potentially leading to global instability. The global financial system is essentially a closed loop. The money that one country borrows often comes from the savings or investments of another country's citizens or institutions. It's a continuous flow of capital seeking the best returns and safest havens. This is why discussions about global debt are so critical. They're not just about abstract numbers, but about the fundamental health and stability of the entire world economy. While the risk of default for major developed economies is extremely low due to their ability to print their own currency and their strong creditworthiness, it's a very real threat for many developing nations. When a country defaults, it can be catastrophic, leading to economic collapse, social unrest, and a loss of access to international capital markets for years. This is why international organizations like the IMF and World Bank play a role in providing loans and advice, often with strict conditions, to help countries manage their debt burdens and avoid default. So, let's circle back to our original question. If every country is in debt, who's the money owed to? The answer, as we've seen, is not a simple one. It's owed to a diverse group of creditors. Your own fellow citizens through their savings, pensions, and investments. Your own banks and financial institutions. Your own central bank, which often creates money to buy government bonds, effectively owing money to itself. Other countries, both their governments and central banks, who hold debt as part of their foreign reserves or for investment, and private investors globally, who seek safe and stable returns. National debt isn't a zero-sum game where one country's debt is another country's asset in a simple bilateral way. It's a complex, multi-layered financial tapestry where capital constantly moves, seeking opportunities and stability. It's a reflection of how governments fund their operations, manage their economies, and respond to the needs of their populations. Understanding this isn't just for economists. It's crucial for every citizen to grasp, because national debt impacts everything from interest rates on your mortgage to the funding of public services and the stability of the global economy. It's a constant balancing act, a testament to the intricate dance between spending, revenue, and investment on a global scale. I hope this video has helped demystify the complex world of national debt and given you a clearer picture of who holds the purse strings in the global economy. If you found this explanation helpful, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who's ever pondered this question, and subscribe for more deep dives into economics and finance. Let me know in the comments below. What surprised you most about who holds national debt? And what other economic paradoxes would you like us to explore? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.